In this lesson, we'll talk about the concept of an attribute as it relates to UV mapping in Houdini. So we're picking up right where we left off from the previous lesson, and we still have this mismatch of attributes warning here on our merge node in the bottom of our concept car. Now we've already fixed the mismatch of the normal attribute. Now what we need to do is fix the mismatch of the UV attribute. If we middle click on the left-hand side at the bottom of the network, we can see here that we still have on the left-hand side a UV attribute, okay? And if we look on the right-hand side, we do not have a UV attribute here. So how do we go about adding that UV attribute to our tire and wheel assembly? I'm going to dive inside of the Wheel 1 subcontainer here. And let's take a look at what we've got with our wheel assembly. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that. So I'm just going to frame it up in the viewport. Now I know I can middle click here and see that I do not have any UVs, but I also want to let you know that you can double check this information by using the UV viewport. Just like we've used before the front, right, and left viewports, Houdini has a UV viewport specifically for viewing this information. Let's go ahead and check that out now. If we use the drop-down underneath the Perspective 1 menu here, we go to Set View and choose UV Viewport. Notice too that the keyboard shortcut for this is 5, so if you wanted to do a quick toggle, you could do spacebar and 5, and that would quickly switch you to your UV viewport. We'll just choose it from the menu for now. So here within your UV viewport, you have the ability of panning and zooming using the same mouse controls that you do inside of the regular 3D viewport. Now, what UV mapping is a way of telling the computer exactly how you want to map surfaces. In other words, if you want to put a texture onto a piece of geometry, a UV map is how you do it. Houdini calls this the UV attribute. And for a more in-depth discussion on exactly how the UVs work, you might check out the Creating Custom Shaders in Houdini course. It goes into a lot more in-depth information about the mathematics behind how UVs work, how coordinates work, and that kind of information. Right now, what we're concerned with is just simply laying out these UVs in a way that we can fix that mismatched attribute back out at our concept car. So with that in mind, let's switch back to our perspective view. I'm going to frame up on my tire and wheel assembly. I'm going to grab the selection tool from the far left-hand toolbar. Make sure that I'm in primitive selection mode, and just drag a nice box around the entire wheel and tire assembly. I'm just going to tumble around in my viewport here a little bit and make sure that I've got all of my faces selected. And it looks like I do. Okay. Now with all of that selected, let's go ahead and use the texture shelf from the top toolbar. We'll scroll over to about the 6th or 7th icon over. It is actually called UV Unwrap. It's right here. It's this one. So let's go ahead and click on that. We can see that our tool here in the viewport now shows this bounding box kind of around our tire and wheel assembly. But you don't really see much of a change to the geometry itself. In order to see the change, you need to be able to see it inside of the UV texture viewport. So let's go ahead and jump back there. We know how to do that with the Set View menu here. We come over to UV Viewport. And now when we look at our UVs, we see that we do have our geometry showing up as a flat 2D representation, and that's exactly what we wanted to accomplish with our UVs. So let's jump back out one level to our concept car and middle click on that Wheel 1 subcontainer. Excellent. We can now see listed in our vertex attributes a UV attribute right here. Also, if we check out our geometry spreadsheet, if we highlight our wheel node and look over in the Vertices tab for the vertex attributes, we'll see that we have normals here, and we also have UVs listed here. So we know that we've got UVs on both sides. So why exactly do we still have this mismatch of attributes showing up? Let's go back to our perspective view. The car seems to look okay. The geometry is displaying just fine. And we know we've got UVs on both sides. But the reason that you still see the mismatched attribute is because the UV attribute that we just applied when we did our UV mapping inside of Houdini is a vertex attribute. Let's middle click on this copy to node so we can see every attribute that's coming in this stream into the merge node. So if we middle click here, we see that we have one point attribute, and it is the position. We have two vertex attributes. One is the normal, and one is the UV, but that is a vertex attribute. Now let's do the same for the left side. We'll come over here, click on the normal, and middle click on that node. Here we see we have 2 point attributes. One is position and one is UV. So on the left-hand side of the merge, the UVs are coming in as point attributes. And now that is just an anomaly that happens sometimes whenever you bring in a model from an external source. The software that created that model, whether it was Cinema 4D or Maya or some other sculpting program, handles its UV attributes as points, as to where Houdini handles them as vertices. But that's not a huge problem. There is a node that will help us out with this. I'm going to go ahead and move my display flag down to the bottom of my tree so that I'm highlighting the merge node. And I'm going to choose an attribute promote node. What an attribute promote node allows us to do is to shift an attribute from being a vertex attribute to a point attribute, or a point attribute to a detail attribute. Basically, it just allows us to move that attribute onto any of those elements that make up the geometry that you see here in the geometry spreadsheet. Remember when we talked about attributes, we showed all of those. We have points, vertices, primitives, and detail attributes. And the attribute promote node lets us just shift any of these around so that we can use those attributes anywhere in this makeup. So back at the scene view, we'll highlight our attribute promote node. Now the name that we want to change is the UV. It says texture UV here. We'll choose that from the list. And originally its class is point. We can double check that by middle clicking on the node above it. And here, yes, we see we have 2 point attributes and one is UV, so that UV is a point attribute. So we go back to our attribute promote. We're taking it from the original point attribute and we're changing it over to be a vertex attribute. Excellent. As soon as we make that change, we see here at the bottom of our network that we no longer have that mismatch of attributes warning. If we middle click, we simply see that we have all of our attributes existing where they need to be correctly so that both sides match. Our geometry is clean and we're ready to move forward. In the next lesson, we'll begin the process of adding materials to our car.